In April 1999, my grandfather Bill Grant passed away at the age of 92. Jim Bowden, the editor from the Australian Timber magazine, wrote a 3-page story on Bill Grant's life and times. I'll read that article to you word for word. I'll also put up some of the old photos we have. It's just a little bit of yesterday. Most of it doesn't really mean a lot to most people, but in saying that, it gives you a bit of an idea of how we did it back in the old days. And it wasn't all that long ago. The Mack truck enthusiasts might get a bit of a kick out of it, as you'll see some of the early wartime Macks we used. We then moved on to the B model Macks and then got into the R models. Snigging logs out of the bush using horse teams is certainly an interesting concept, considering how easily we do it nowadays. You'll see the migration from the horse teams to the winch winders and then onto the International TD14 tractors, soon after the International TD15, and then onto the Cat D7G bulldozers that we still use today. The 2 Clark forklifts you'll see in the movie are still being used today. You'll see a lot of updates to the sawmill along the way. Most of those buildings still stand. I mainly put this clip together so that the 3-page story wouldn't get lost in some folder buried in some filing cabinet somewhere. At least when this hits the internet, it'll bounce around the world for the next 200 years. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it. Every now and then there comes an opportunity to present a life story about a great timber industry pioneer, a great Australian. Now sadly these stories often unfold after the passing of these personalities, and just as sadly they can go untold and unrecorded. Now not so with the Grant family of Woodford Sawmill. Now Bob Grant and son Shane Grant lost their father and grandfather in April 1999, and the detailed records and photographs of an era that consumed the interests of Billy Grant, born in 1907, were used to give a glimpse into the life of this very special man. In an atmosphere of bewildering change in the native forestry industry, with the RFA process and its conservation objectives darkening the outlook for many Queensland timber communities, it's refreshing to have this opportunity to reflect on a period in the industry that was, yes, very tough, but somehow happier and definitely more spiritually rewarding. Now the heading of the article reads, Hardwood sawmiller Bill Grant belonged to an era too few in the industry would appreciate today. It goes on to say, William Robert Grant was born into tough times on a September day in 1907 at Oakey on Queensland's Darling Downs. There were no handouts for Billy Grant, one of 8 surviving children in a family of 10 born to Maria and William Grant. Now Bill Grant will relate how his father, Boss, as he was known, would ride to Jimna during the Depression to work on the Jimna Range with a pick and shovel for a fortnight for 10 pence a day to help support the family. Now while his father was away, the chores were left to Bill and his brothers and sisters since their mother had died at childbirth. So Bill learnt how to work and appreciate any benefits that were gained. One of his early chores was to feed the horse teams before and after school. He would run several miles to school in Benarkin to get there on time and then run back home again in time for the afternoon feed session. Now after finishing school at the age of 13, Bill worked for his father, Boss Grant, with the horse teams until his late teens, when he then had a stint on a Western sheep property. Bill Grant often told the story of stopping outside the pub at Kynuna and finding an Aboriginal on the steps. He wandered over and said, "Hello, Jackie, how far is it to Darwin?" And the Aboriginal looked up at Bill and said, "Hey mate, how'd you know my name was Jackie?" And Bill said, "Oh, I just guessed it." At which Jackie replied, "Well then, best you guess how far it is to Darwin." Now Bill met and married Marion in 1933 and they had 3 children, Jean, Robert and Ian. Now Bill's mischievous ways, coupled with a strong sense of respecting what you were given, were instilled in his children. Once when the children were very young, Bill poured them a glass of lemonade, which was a real treat back in those days. Jean and Bob complained when they noticed that one glass had a little more in it than the other. Now Bill took a drink and evened it up. As both continued to complain that their drinks were not even, Bill kept drinking from each glass until both glasses were nearly empty. It was a lesson never to be forgotten. In 1936, in Bill's early timber getting days, Bill Grant built a winder on the back of a solid-tired International truck. It had about 1 mile of rope on it, and he used a horse named Peter to drag the rope down to the logs. A bell wire was set up to signal the man on the winder to stop and start the winch so that they could take the rope in and out of the pulley blocks as it came up and around the corners. Peter, the horse, was killed on a loading ramp when a log rolled on him, and it was a sad day for Bill Grant. Bill said then, "A horse you can only find one in a lifetime." Bill recalled how Peter would work on verbal command. When the log had been winched up the hill, Peter would follow the log up and be ready to drag the rope back down. A big improvement on actually taking a 12-horse team down into the bush to pick up a log. That required wide tracks and turnaround areas. Now Bob Grant remembers the year 1940 when he helped his father at the loading ramp. They had 2 ramps built. One had bed logs on while the second had top logs on, he recalls. They used to sneak the logs onto the ramp with the horse team. Bob's job at 4 years of age was to chock the log each time his father rolled it up another few inches with the cantle. In 1945, at the end of World War II, Bill Grant moved into the sawmilling side of the timber industry, shifting to Kedron in Brisbane to start a business with his brother Jack. The logs were harvested from the Blackbutt district area, cut with cross-cut saws and axes and snugged to the ramp with horse teams. They were then loaded onto the truck and then taken to Banark and Rail Yard and sent to Brisbane for loading onto timber jinkers for transport to the Kedron sawmill. In those days, it was difficult to buy circular saws. Bob Grant can remember old saws being used with cracks in them 200 millimetres long. His father would drill a hole in the base of the crack in an attempt to halt its deterioration. In 1948, the Grants were harvesting timber from the Ravensbourne district from mainly private sources. Bill and Jack were harvesting with a Chev Blitz, and while then they purchased their first tractor, an International TD14 with an Armstrong Holland winch and an angle blade. At this stage, a road transport permit system was introduced, and they were then able to transport logs direct to Kedron. So they purchased 2 Ford Thornton diesel trucks for the task. In 1951, Bill Grant went out on his own, purchasing a mill at Geebung in Brisbane. The mill employed 8 men, with 4 in the bush and was equipped with a frame saw, rack bench and number one bench. Without forklifts in those days, they used the Chev Blitz to handle logs in the yard, and by this time they were logging mostly in the North Coast region. Logging equipment was upgraded to international dozers and international trucks, and the market was primarily hardwood house frames. The business was flourishing by 1959, but Bill, besides being a hard worker, was also a forward thinker and was never content to sit back. He was always looking to do the best for his family. He saw an opportunity in 1959 to buy a small rundown sawmill in Woodford, so he was on the move again. The mill north of Brisbane was run by steam and Bill converted it to electricity. It was a similar setup to G-Bung with a frame saw, rack bench and number one bench. The gear was pretty well worn out, but they worked it for 1 year before they completely gutted the whole sawmill production line and installed brand new equipment. McKee Engineering supplied a 4-head ride-on hydraulic carriage and saw rig. The bush operation was equipped with international tractors, and the trucks were upgraded to Mack trucks. And the first of the fleet was an ex-Army NR Mack. Logs were now unloaded with an overhead gantry, but still handled by blitz into the sawmill. Sawmilling activity at G-Bung shut down in 1960, and the yard served as the Grant family's hardwood retail outlet. All timber was then delivered with a single drive Bedford Island cab tip truck. The 4-head carriage was then replaced in 1965 with another McKee 5-head riderless carriage, the first of its type ever built. The bench was replaced with a McKee hob feed 2-man bench, and soon after the log yard was levelled and gravelled to pave way for 2 Clark 25,000-pound forklifts. Bill Grant installed the best machinery available at the time, and up until his last days he took great delight in driving around the log yard and going to Belthorpe to look at the trees. Now on September 25, 1967, the Brandon sawmill at Belthorpe was destroyed by fire, setting in place a chain of events that would change the lives of the Grant family forever. On January 25, 1971, Grants amalgamated with Brandon Timbers, primarily to access their log quota for the Woodford sawmill. Now, at about this time, the Grants also amalgamated with the Brandons and the Croc family to purchase the Hancock and Gore mill at Jimna. Now, the shifter licensed to Crop's Kilcoy sawmill, where Kilcoy Timbers was formed. In 1972, Brandon's was then taken over by a New South Wales company called Robb and Brown, who wanted to dispose of Brandon's sawmilling interests in Queensland. The Grant family was given an opportunity to buy back the Brandon's interest in the Woodford sawmill, plus their substantial land holdings in the Belthorpe area. The Grants purchased their first planer in 1973, which was set up at G-Bung with no kiln. They strip-dried the product at G-Bung. Logging equipment got a new facelift with a new Timberjack 420 log skidder. It was the first of its kind in the area. Soon after, a Caterpillar D7G was purchased with a high free spool winch fitted. A 1-man McKee bench and a Brux 1300 wood chipper was installed in 1983. And the same year, the Grants successfully swung the forestry department into allowing them to adopt the key tree logging system. Now, this got us away from the pre-dinosaur idea from our state government of felling trees every which way and not allowing them to be removed before they were crowned. Now, the policy that was developed on our property saw the Grants working the bush in a far more organised fashion. They picked up what they called the key tree, they felled the tree and then immediately snug it to the ramp. continuing to fall other trees in its place. This approach caused minimum damage to the bush. Now, the Forestry Department in Queensland was very slow to catch onto it, but we eventually won them over, says Bob Grant. The Grants retired their trusty Bedford tipper in 1985 and purchased a second-hand Toyota Hino Crano truck from Playsteds of Nunda. Now, this marked the start of another new era for the Grant family. The Geebung retail operation was wound down in favour of delivering sawn timber direct from the Woodford sawmill onto the builder's site with the crane truck. Now, Bill and Marion Grant were involved with racehorses for many years. They had experience with horse teams, stock horses, and were able to race a couple of fine horses, two of them being Blue Lee and Stereogram. Bill Grant would travel from Brisbane to Toowoomba to be there daybreak to see his horses work. Bill was never one to take someone else's word. He would always make his own judgment. Bill was also a great storyteller. He could recite poems and tell stories for hours on end. He could remember entire poems like My Brother Ben and I. And once, while driving with friends, he started a story at Linville and was still telling the story when they reached Brisbane. In 10 short years, Bill Grant was unlucky to lose his son Ian in 1965, his wife Marion in 1971, and his daughter Jean in 1975. He never complained about his life nor his losses. He spoke of his childhood as something to be cherished, and throughout his life he took all the setbacks in his stride, just got up the next day and went on with it. It was hurting Bill Grant deep down, but he never let it show. He was close to his brothers and sisters and their families. From time to time they would also go on trips or visit each other, sharing all those close-knit family things. Bill never forgot where he came from. Over the years he made a lot of friends from various places, including the timber industry, the Brisbane Hoo-Hoo Club, his foray into horse racing, bowling, and of course from his earlier days, the Blackbutt and Banarkin districts. He had some good mates from those early days, men such as Mick Simpson and Sonny Closey, who worked in the industry that he loved. They all eventually joined the relatively reserved game of lawn bowls. Never ones to miss an opportunity for a bit of fun, they decided to drill a hole in the kitty, fill it with lead and repaint it. When it was the opponent's turn to roll the kitty, they were given the lead-filled ball, which would career across the other side of the green to the amazement of everyone, except Bill and his mates. Before anyone realised what had happened, one of them would immediately walk over, pick up the kitty and switch it for the real one. Although Bill spent the later part of his life in poor health, Bill Grant took each day as it came and was always happy to go for a drive or an outing to keep everyone entertained with his stories and wit. The sharpness of his mind never ceased to amaze. The industry salutes a good father, grandfather, a great-grandfather, and a great and gifted timberman. Billy Grant, gone but not forgotten. Now you can see where we get our drive and passion from. It's crazy stuff to think that it wasn't all that long ago we were snigging logs out of the bush using bullock and horse teams. My grandfather was snigging logs using just a few horses. It definitely is an end of an era. And now my son is using a 200 horsepower Tiger Cat log skidder. Now take a look at that big sucker in action. Yes, hasn't it all changed? Working in the bush has always been a dangerous workplace. So the mechanisation has helped us to make it a safer workplace. Machines like the one you're looking at now can do a marvellous job. My son Ethan pilots these machines. He's seen here preparing some logs to be loaded out tomorrow to head to our sawmill. Have a look at him cut that waste bit off the end of that log. As Bill Grant would say, in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail. If you and I were doing it, we'd still be trying to get the damn chainsaw to start. Anyway, I'll get out of his way and I'll let him concentrate. If you need some advice on your hardwood requirements, give us a call anytime. We're only too happy to help where we can. So stay safe and we'll see you next time.
We're gonna let it all hang out.